Eighth graders, today we're going to be working on doing some reading and annotating in the companion text, which is Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges. Before we start talking about that, though, the annotations, the jotting that you'll be doing, I wanted to just show you what it looks like on my desktop to be reading the book online at archive.org. Okay, if you've gotten it through another source, that's perfectly fine, but I just wanted to give you an example and show you some of the controls and how this works if you got it here. Okay, I'm going to take away my picture there for a second just so that you can see over here. The book will be opened right sort of in the middle of your desktop, and then your controls are over here. You can flip your pages. You can start flipping through the book to the right, and then you can go back to the left, whatever you need to do. You can view the book one page at a time or a two-page spread. That's how I've mostly been doing it. You can have a thumbnail view of the whole book, but of course, that's not very practical for reading it. And let me go back to the two-page spread here. What I like to do is zoom in so that I can see it a little better, and then you can control on the bars on the side here, up and down, which part you're reading. That just makes it a little more visible for me. And then I've been zooming out the opposite way to see the pictures and read those captions. Now, one thing that I didn't even notice the first couple of times that I've had this book open is that you can actually have this book read to you right here. Um, there's a little button that you can click and it will read it to you. I wasn't even thinking of that when I was thinking of asking you to borrow the book from Archive, but that is a handy thing if you want to listen to it rather than read it yourself. I just zoomed in on it and read the whole thing myself and did my notes, but that's completely up to you. I'll just play a little clip here so that you can hear what it sounds like when you have it read to you.
Dear reader, for a bonus extra, 2 carat WB working in the world of civil rights and teaching.
So you can see it's a little odd having it read to you because it reads kind of funny and doesn't have the expression that it would have if you just read it yourself in your own head. You can be using proper expression where the computer will not do that. I want to give you some examples of how I've been handling jotting about Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges, because since it's online, I won't be using sticky notes. I'm going to be using opening a document, or actually, I think I made it a slide. I did. I made a Google slide example of reading and annotating. So I just made a blank slide and then I started reading. And when I had an idea for a jot, I just clicked back over to my slide and I jotted that down. I'm making a bulleted list, which I'll show you, but I'm going to read here first. Okay, so I'm going to start on the first page after the quote to the beginning of the book. When I was 6 years old, the civil rights movement came knocking at the door. It was 1960, and history pushed in and swept me right up in a whirlwind. At the time, I knew little about the racial fears and hatred in Louisiana, where I was growing up. Young children never know about racism at the start. It's we adults who teach it. Okay, so right away in that first paragraph, I had a thought. So I went on to my first slide and I wrote down, reading this part, I understand that Ruby Bridges is writing this story as an adult. You can tell right through her introduction that she is thinking back to a time when she was a child. So she's written this much later in her life. Back to the reading. In spite of the after effects of the whirlwind, I feel privileged now to have been part of the civil rights struggle. The 1950s and 60s were important decades. Negroes, as African Americans were known then, dared at last to demand equal treatment as American citizens. School integration was only one part of the struggle, but it was an absolutely essential part. In 1954, In 1954, coincidentally, the year I was born, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered the end of, quote, separate but equal, unquote, education for African American children. Because of her race, Linda Brown was not allowed to attend her local, let's see, let me go back up here, her local elementary school. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court agreed that Linda had a legal right to go to that school. But for years afterward, the court looked the other way when states in the South ignored its order. Black children in states like Louisiana and Mississippi continued to attend all Black public schools. White children went to separate and usually better schools. Okay, I was having another thought or realization after that section, and I went back to my jots. This is the page where I'm jotting, and I did my second bullet. The Supreme Court outlawed segregated schools in 1954, but most of them stayed segregated for many years after. And that's pretty shocking, right? To think about, this was 1960 when Ruby Bridges is beginning her story. So 6 years after the Supreme Court ruling, and the schools were still not integrated. Okay, let's see. Back to the reading. By 1957, less than 2% of Southern schools had been integrated. That year, 9 Black high school students enrolled in a white school in Little Rock, Arkansas. The white segregationists in Arkansas were furious. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered federal troops, soldiers with rifles and machine guns mounted on military jeeps, to protect the quote unquote, Little Rock Nine, unquote, in their school. Even after the events in Little Rock, Louisiana continued to ignore its African American children. However, the civil rights movement was growing stronger. A federal court gave the city a deadline for school integration, September 1960. I don't remember everything about that school year, but there are events and feelings I will never forget. In writing this book, I recall how integration looked to me then, when I was 6 and limited to my own small world. However, as an adult, I wanted to fill in some of the blanks about what was a serious racial crisis in the American South. I have tried to give you the bigger picture through my eyes. After I read that part, I realized that that I was noticing the title comes from Ruby Bridges wanting to tell her story as she experienced it through her own eyes. So that's where she got the title for her book. Next, I'm going to skip ahead to a part a few pages down the road in the book and tell you how, as I started to go through the book, as I started to read through it more, my jots became longer and I started to make more connections to the book and connections with Claudette Colvin as well, since these are companion books. They're about the same time period and they're both nonfiction, right? So I'm making connections between the two. There are a lot of similarities. So the section that I'm going to read to you next is on page 14. And at this point in the book, Ruby Bridges has been selected to be one of the first young ladies that is actually going to go to school in one of these previously all white schools. She's going to be the one who desegregates this elementary school. Okay, so starting right here on the second paragraph, it says, there were 4 of us in all. There was a 5th girl originally, but her parents decided at the last minute not to transfer her. 3 of the remaining children, all girls, were to go to a school named McDonough. I was the 4th child. I was going to integrate William Frantz Public School, and I was going alone. On Sunday, November 13th, my mother told me that I would start a new school the next day. She hinted that there could be something unusual about it, but she didn't explain. There might be a lot of people outside the school, she said, but you don't need to be afraid. I'll be with you. All I remember thinking that night was that I wouldn't be going to school with my friends anymore, and I wasn't happy about that. So like any typical 6-year-old, she wasn't really thinking of the larger implications of what was happening. She was just really thinking about herself and missing her friends, thinking that she was going to have to go to school without them. So further down on the page, it shows a picture of these 2 white gentlemen. And the one on the left is James Davis, and he was the governor of Louisiana. He was for segregation. So he actually had threatened to close the public schools rather than have them integrated. And on the right is J. Skelly Wright. He was United States District Justice, and he was dedicated to equal opportunity for all Americans. He was for integration. He blocked the segregationists again and again in his rulings. So when I read this page, I was having a lot of noticings and a lot of connections to Claudette Colvin. So I went back to my slides, and I actually had to start a new slide for page 14. Um, the first thing I wrote down was that I noticed a few similarities on this page between Ruby Bridges and Claudette Colvin. One of these is that they were both firsts. Claudette was the first teenager to get arrested for refusing to give up her seat for a white passenger, and Ruby was the first Black child to attend a formerly all-white school. Next, on that same page, I also noticed on this page that there were pictures of the white mayor and the white judge who blocked segregation again and again. I think this is important because it shows that there were many whites who supported integration. Generally speaking, Blacks were treated horribly during this time period, but there were many kind and helpful whites who sympathized with the Blacks and did important things to help the cause. Okay, so those were just some important thoughts that I was having that I wanted to get written down about this page, and especially how it's connecting to. There's just so many similarities with Claudette Colvin that I think we're going to be able to utilize later when we're trying to formulate our thesis statements. Okay, so I hope that you spend some time today reading through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges and doing your own jots and entries for this section.